You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
Morning decisions. How about a creamy mocha frappuccino drink? Or sweet vanilla? Smooth caramel, maybe? Or a white chocolate mocha? Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Find Starbucks Frappuccino drinks wherever you buy your groceries.
This episode is brought to you by State Farm. You know those friends who support your preference for podcasts over music on road trips? That's the energy State Farm brings to insurance. With over 19,000 local agents, they help you find the coverage that fits your needs, so you can spend less time worrying about insurance and more time enjoying the ride. Download the State Farm app or go online at statefarm.com. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 255, Greece, Part 7, The Invasion Ends. This week, a big thank you goes out to Chris, Grim, and Max for supporting the podcast by becoming members. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. The German invasion of Greece had started on April 6, 1941. And just 10 days later, the decision would be finalized for the evacuation of all British forces that had been brought into Greece. During those 10 days, there had been some successes, and there would be a few further successes for the British and Greek defenders, but those successes were always on a relatively small scale. A unit here would hold for a few days, a pass would be defended well, but none of these small successes could make up for the challenges faced when it came to the strategic situation or simple geography. Once the German forces were able to attack out of Yugoslavia, the entire Allied defense plan began to fall apart immediately, and it never really recovered. The decision to evacuate would be made in mid-April, although it would take a few weeks before the evacuation really got rolling during the last few days of April. Between those dates, the fighting would continue, the Greeks would surrender, and the British would try to throw together an evacuation plan that saved as many men as possible. Just days after the start of the German advance, after their retreat from the Metaxas line, a little bit of panic began to creep into both Greek political and military leaders. Due to the forced retreat from the line and the issues caused by the German advance, a considerable portion of the Greek forces that had been previously defending the northeast frontier simply no longer existed. Much like the British forces retreating out of the Ali-Akman line, the Greek forces were just searching for some place to try and slow the Germans down, and the hopes of doing so were rapidly dwindling. General Papagos, in particular, who was the head of the Greek military, was probably the most important person who needed to believe in continued victory, and he had mostly given up by April 14th. On that date, he would call Prince Peter into his office and tell him that he believed that the Germans and Italians would soon occupy all of Greece, and that he, the prince, should prepare to surrender and go into captivity. As a member of the Greek royal family, Prince Peter, while a military officer, simply refused to believe that surrender was inevitable, and he told Papagos that he intended to continue the fight until the end. Quote, "I will do anything to avoid capture, even if it means going into the mountains as a partisan with a Tommy gun. Wars are different now, and not even you, Papagos, can demand compliance with such an order as long as there is a chance of winning the war." End quote. The friction between Papagos and Peter was not easily resolved, but the Greek King George found a way around it by appointing the prince his adjutant, and so he had to travel with the king. This was important because the king was planning to leave Greece as quickly as possible, and in fact the cruiser and destroyers that would take him to Crete were already available. After some issues getting the sailors to follow orders, the Greek ships would leave for Crete on the night of April 18th, taking the king, the prince, and the Greek government to Crete. While Crete was part of Greece, and that meant that they were not going into exile quite yet, they would quickly be forced to also evacuate from Crete, and so they would be yet another government in exile that had fled from the German advance. While the Greek royal family was working on its own evacuation, and while the Greek and British forces in northern Greece were still in retreat, there was still the question of what to do with the Greek forces that were in Albania. They had advanced into Albania over the previous 6 months, and they were hesitant to just give up that territory voluntarily. But this put the roughly 200,000 Greek soldiers in Albania in an odd position. The commander of the Greek forces in the area also did not have any clear direction from Papagos and military command, and so all of his forces were kind of just stuck in limbo. Without clear orders, they began to plan on their own initiative, with the assembled commanders believing that the best course of action was to seek an immediate armistice with the Germans to try and end the fighting before the Greek army totally collapsed and before the Italians could attack. They did not want to surrender to the Italians. Papagos was informed of these plans, but immediately refused to allow it to happen. But Papagos was also very quickly reaching the point in mid-April where his ability to influence the flow of events was diminishing very quickly. Papagos was also at that point dealing with a lot of coordination issues with the British. The two allies had never been truly unified in their goals for the defense of Greece. Differences had always been present, but they probably would not have caused major issues if defenses had been good on the Ali-Akman line. One thing that was absolutely essential when armies began to retreat is that they maintained some kind of cohesion, whether that's among the units or even among the different armies. Retreats are chaotic enough when everybody is on the same page about how decisions should be made, and the British and Greeks were absolutely not on the same page. Initially, the British commander, Wilson, believed that the Greeks in Albania would retreat south out of Albania to help with the defense against the German advance. When they did not, and the British retreat started, Wilson moved much faster to the mental position that there was no stopping to defend. The evacuation had to begin happening as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, Papagos was still trying, even if he was not optimistic about events, to rebuild some kind of defensive line, but that was only possible if the British agreed with him on where it should occur. The truth was that Wilson and the British military leaders knew that at the end of the day, their goals were not to save Greece, but instead to protect British interests in Greece. And if that was no longer possible, then their best course of action was to preserve as much of the British forces as possible. They would be needed for the next fight on the next battleground. That's why on April 15th, as the British forces began to move towards the Thermopylae defensive positions, simultaneous orders went out to begin evacuation preparations. On April 16th, Wilson and Papagos would be able to discuss the British plans for evacuation, and instead of pushing back against the idea, given his pessimistic views on the overall situation, Papagos supported the British decision. At some point, the best thing for Greece was to reduce the amount of fighting that happened in Greece as much as possible, to reduce the damage done to the country and the number of Greeks harmed by the fighting. While the British probably would have moved towards evacuation regardless of Greek thoughts on the matter, it at least assured that the two allies would continue to work together until it was time for the Greek forces on the mainland to surrender. Wilson sent his plans to Wavell back in Egypt and added the response from the Greeks, and Wavell stopped any additional shipments to Greece so that evacuation planning and preparations could begin in earnest. Much like in France, the overall estimates for the number of forces that could be evacuated ranged from very few to less than half, and most of the higher-end estimates were based on the idea that the Thermopylae defenses were held for a lengthy period of time, which would not end up being the case. Due to the critical nature of evacuation planning, Wavell would actually fly to Wilson's headquarters in Athens on April 19th to ensure everybody was on the same page about what was going to happen. During those discussions, there were some slivers of optimism, with Wilson proposing that maybe the Greek and British forces might be able to hold on to the Thermopylae line for an extended period. Given how fighting had been going, others were still skeptical, and any firm defense would have required the British forces to be all in, and for more supplies and men to be brought in from Egypt. Wavell was not going to let that happen. He was far from convinced that any line in Greece could be held for any length of time, and he was probably right to be pessimistic. One of the bigger problems for the British is that even if they wanted to hold the Thermopylae line, even if they wanted to move more forces into Greece, more supplies into Greece, even if they wanted to go all in on defending the Thermopylae line, as the Germans moved south, the threat posed by the Luftwaffe to the operations of the Royal Navy grew more and more and more. And so any long-term defense of Greece would require at least some control of the air. And every moment, every mile that the Germans moved south, the threat from the Luftwaffe continued to grow. Now, the RAF had been involved in Greece for some time before the German invasion. They had launched attacks against Italian shipping and against Italian bombing attacks of Greek cities. However, with the arrival of the Luftwaffe, they began to run into the exact same issues they had in France. The RAF fighters were always outnumbered, and the Luftwaffe would constantly launch attacks against their airfields, which, even if they did not actually destroy aircraft, just made it more difficult to keep the British sortie rate up. It was also just demoralizing for the ground crews to be constantly under attack and then having to displace and shift around to different airfields as the overall fighting front migrated south. Eventually, all of the remaining RAF aircraft were pushed back to airfields around Athens. It would be from these airfields that they would fight in their last major air battle on April 20th, with 15 Hurricanes attacking over 120 German aircraft over Athens. These 15 aircraft performed pretty well, all things considered. They would down 22 German aircraft, but they lost 10 of their number. By that point, it was only a matter of time before the RAF squadrons began their own evacuation, which they would do over the following days, with the last Hurricanes on their way out by the 23rd, and the final RAF aircraft leaving mainland Greece for Crete on the 24th.
Spring Black Friday is on at the Home Depot. Save on grills and patio sets that will be sure to bring your hosting game up a notch. Fire up your feast with help from the Home Depot and save on grills. Like the Next Grill 4-burner propane gas grill was $249, now in special buy for $199. Or give everyone the best seat in the yard with the Hampton Bay Mayfield Park 4-piece conversation set for only $399. Save on grills and patio sets with low prices guaranteed during Spring Black Friday only at the Home Depot. Now through April 22nd, while supplies last. Exclusions apply. See homedepot.com/price match for details.
K-pop Demon Hunters Haja Boys breakfast meal and Huntrix meal have just dropped at McDonald's. They're calling this a battle for the fans. What do you say to that, Rumi?
It's not a battle. So glad the Saja Boys could take breakfast and give our meal the rest of the day.
It is an honor to share.
No, it's our honor.
It is our larger honor.
No, really. Stop.
You can really feel the respect in this battle. Pick a meal to pick a side.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba. At participating McDonald's while supplies last.
None of these arguments that were happening between Wilson and Papagos and the Greek leaders or the British leaders changed the situation for the Greek forces in Albania, who were very rapidly reaching a point where a decision would have to be made, one way or the other, as eventually they would no longer have the ability to retreat. And so even as the fighting continued in the south, the officers in Albania began to plan their surrender, which would occur on April 20th. This decision was made by the commanders in Albania without any real decision being made in Athens. Instead, the commanders on the scene were simply out of patience with Papagos and the other Greek leaders back in the capital, and they did it themselves. The Germans made the decision to keep the negotiations secret from the Italians, and Mussolini and the Italian leaders were not happy with the result. They had wanted to launch an attack to have their own victory over the Greeks, and the Germans had just robbed them of it. This was one of the reasons that the negotiations happened in the first place, though, with the Greek officers also not wanting to give the Italians the satisfaction of defeating them. After the agreements were reached, the German forces would then move in between the Italians and the Greeks to prevent further fighting. In total, the Greek forces would suffer around 55,000 casualties fighting the Italians in Albania. 23,000 would be captured along the way as well. The Italians had lost a similar amount, and all of that was now over because of the Germans. It was a disappointing end on both sides of the Italo-Greek War. For the Italians, obviously, they'd not gotten at all what they wanted out of the fighting. But also for the Greeks, they had started off so successfully and had been unable to really defeat the Italians before the arrival of the Germans. The soldiers in Albania, or the Greek soldiers in Albania, got off pretty well actually, with most of them being allowed to return home by the Germans. Officers were even allowed to retain their sidearms. Meanwhile, in the south, the plans for the evacuation were under constant revision during the period between when the decision was made on the 16th and when the evacuations actually began. The original plan was to wait until April 27th, but this rapidly became untenable due to the deterioration of the situation in Greece, and therefore the evacuations were moved up. The entire plan was then further complicated by the fact that the RAF was forced to essentially abandon Greece, and the Luftwaffe began to flex its muscle. This included a devastating raid on a convoy on ships on the 21st and into the 22nd of April, which would result in the destruction of 23 ships from the convoy. With so much threat from the air, the decision was made to execute the evacuation strictly with fast-moving military vessels, and only at night. The destroyers that were used were faster and safer, but of course not as efficient at actually transporting troops off the beaches. There were other ships as well, including a few converted civilian liners that had been converted to assault landing ships, which meant that they were just going to be used in the exact opposite sort of way that they were designed for. Instead of dropping troops off, they were picking things up. The key feature in all of the ships that were used was that they were fast, because what they wanted to be able to do was to stay as far away from Greece as possible until it got dark, and then race in to the coast, pick up as many men as possible, and then race back out to get as far away as possible by the time that dawn came around. And so that's why they had to be fast. That's why they couldn't use all the ships that were available, because they just would have been attacked by the Luftwaffe and they would have just lost more men. However, as the evacuation progressed, every possible means would be used to get as many troops as possible out of Greece. There were some civilian vessels that were used, every type of fast naval vessel. There were even aircraft that were used for an airlift. There would be stories of Blenheims being packed full of men in their bomb bays and turrets while they ran shuttle services from Greece to Crete. As with every military evacuation that would take multiple nights to complete, during those nights, some forces would have to stay in the line to delay the German advance. It was a balancing act for these forces, as every night they held the line, or at least slowed the German advance, more troops were evacuated, but each night also reduced their own chances of evacuation. Before combat troops started getting on ships, the first groups to be evacuated were British civilians that were in Greece as part of the military expedition. They began to evacuate on the night of April 22nd to 23rd, with many of the civilians and also base troops being loaded on civilian liners and yachts that were made available for the purpose. Then on the 24th, most of the headquarters staff and other adjacent troops were evacuated from ports near Athens. One very important fact of the evacuations is that, with a few exceptions for the ruling family, the Greek troops were not allowed to board any British evacuation vessels. Unfortunately for future events and for the men, this included the Cretan forces of the 5th Cretan Division, who were really just trying to find their way back home to Crete, and would have been very valuable in the weeks that followed, because they absolutely would have fought to defend Crete. For everybody who did get on board any of the evacuation vessels during the last week of April, the trip to Crete was perilous, with the Luftwaffe constantly attempting to find and intercept any shipping out of Greece, with 26 vessels eventually being destroyed by German air attacks, resulting in 2,000 deaths. On the night of April 24th to 25th, the evacuation of frontline forces would begin, with the men being told that the evacuation was strictly focused on getting men off the beaches, and any equipment should be left behind. This meant that vehicles, weapons, and ammunition had to be destroyed as quickly and efficiently as possible, including running the engines of vehicles to the point of seizure after draining the oil to prevent them from falling into German hands. A large group of troops would be picked up near Athens, while another would be picked up from a Peloponnesian port. And as the nights progressed, the evacuation points would move strictly to the Peloponnese as the Germans moved into the areas around Athens. One of the frequent refrains during the busy days of the evacuation between the 24th and the 29th of April were that there were often communication challenges and confusion about exactly where units needed to be at night to get picked up. This was particularly problematic because all of the evacuation vessels were in a hurry, arriving when it was dark and then trying to make their way away from Greece by the time that the sun began to come up, with the light bringing the Luftwaffe. One example of this would be the 19 Australian Brigade, which would move to its assigned beaches at Megara during the night of April 25th to 26th. As with other evacuating units, they would destroy their vehicles to prevent them from falling into the hands of the enemy, only to then learn that their evacuation beaches had been changed. They then had to rapidly be on the move to make it to their new pickup locations. Fortunately, most of the men were actually able to make the trip and they were evacuated. This is one of the rare stories of miscommunication that resulted in success. Many of them meant that troops just got left behind. There were other types of miscommunications as well. For example, when the Royal Navy ships arrived at Kalamata on the night of April 26th, instead of 8,000 or so troops that they were expecting to bring aboard, there were 16,000 men waiting for evacuation. Chaos did ensue, but half would remain disappointed when the ships pulled away just before 3 a.m., leaving them behind. This is one of those situations where you certainly can't blame the Navy. The convoy of ships out of Kalamata did all that they could on the night. In fact, they stayed a little bit too long to load more men onto the ships because they were spotted by a group of Stukas shortly after dawn as they were trying to move away from Greece. This brought in German attacks during the morning, and in fact 9 total attacks would be launched on the ships as they frantically sailed south towards Crete. Apparently, one of the reasons that none of the ships were hit is credited to the fact that many of the fighting units had brought with them the machine guns that they had been issued and had used in Greece. That meant that, as far as one man estimated, the SS City of London, a converted passenger liner that was used for the evacuation, there would be 84 Vickers, Brin, and Hotchkiss machine guns added to its anti-aircraft armament and manned by Army soldiers. I have no idea what the exact impact of these guns were, but we do know that 7 German aircraft were shot down for the loss of no British ships that were moving out of Kalamata. So I have to give them some credit, at least. Unfortunately for the men who had been left behind at Kalamata, they would not be able to wait another night for the evacuation to take place, and they would instead mostly be captured when the Germans arrived. There were a few very small groups that were able to escape from this area and make their way by various means out of Greece, but that did not help the vast majority of those that had been left behind, with many of them being base troops that had been held back specifically because they wanted to load more combat soldiers onto the ships that were available. Elsewhere in Greece, some units would be evacuated over the nights of April 28th and 29th, but the evacuation was called off after April 30th. In total, around 50,000 men had been brought out of Greece, which certainly was not nothing. However, 14,000 or so would be left behind due to both communication errors and there simply not being enough time to bring them out of Greece. Much like the evacuation at Dunkirk less than a year earlier, all the men who were evacuated did so without any of their heavy equipment, which would take some time to replenish to bring them back up to fighting strength. Many would also find their way to Crete, where they would find that their fighting was far from over. For the people of Greece, the evacuation of the British forces meant an end to the fighting, at least for a time. They would settle in for occupation, which would be a very long period of hardship. Resistance would also play a major role in the story of wartime Greece, a story for a later series. After the evacuation was complete, Churchill, who had played a major role in committing British forces to Greece in the first place, would write to Wavell that, quote, "We have paid our debt of honor with far less loss than I feared," end quote. Even if the price of men was lower than expected, the entire expedition was nothing short of a disaster. It was just another in a long list of countries that the British had moved their military forces in to assist, only for that assistance to end in complete failure. It would also result in the war spreading to the eastern Mediterranean, further reducing the scope of British influence in the region. The only hope was that they could retain control of the island of Crete as a base for the RAF and the Royal Navy to maintain some level of influence in the area. But the island of Crete was exactly where the Germans would plan their next action, actions that we will begin to cover next episode.